At first, it looks like an inconvenience, a flicker, a soft click in the refrigerator relay, the fan slowing as if the air itself has thickened, and then the house goes acoustically hollow because the constant electrical noise you never noticed has vanished, and your brain interprets the sudden stillness as threat. Outside, streetlights blink out in a staggered pattern that tells you this is not a local breaker, but a system losing coordination, feeder by feeder, substation by substation, until the grid stops behaving like a machine and starts behaving like a chain of stressed components snapping under load. Phones still show bars for a few minutes, but the towers are running on batteries sized for brief outages. Water still comes from the tap, but only because reservoirs and elevated tanks are giving you stored pressure. Cash registers still open, but only until the point-of-sale systems cannot authenticate. The danger is not darkness, it is time, because modern life is buffered by thin layers of stored energy and assumed resupply, and those buffers drain silently. When the blackout is widespread, every household becomes a small, closed system forced to manage heat, water, sanitation, information, and security with no external stabilizers. And the first serious mistakes happen before the lights go out, when people treat the warning signals as background noise. Blackouts are rarely single failures because the grid does not collapse the way a lamp breaks. It collapses when synchrony is lost. An alternating current grid survives because generators spin in phase, holding frequency near a narrow target, and because operators balance supply and demand second by second using reserves, protective relays, and automatic load shedding. When a large generator trips or a transmission corridor is lost to fire, ice, or equipment fault, the remaining machines must instantly provide the missing power, which means their rotating mass gives up kinetic energy and the frequency begins to sag. If it sags too far, protection systems disconnect more equipment to avoid damage, and that defensive behavior can fragment the grid into islands that cannot support their own loads. You may hear the word cascade and picture something dramatic, but the mathematics is brutally simple. When current reroutes onto fewer lines, each conductor heats faster, sags, and approaches its thermal limit. Relays open, power reroutes again, the next segment overloads, and the cascade accelerates. Restoration is slow not because engineers are confused, but because many assets, especially high-voltage transformers, cannot be restarted like a light switch. They require coordinated sequencing, stable frequency, and sometimes physical inspection, and they can be destroyed by inrush currents if re-energized carelessly. The survival protocol begins with accepting this physics. If the grid fails broadly, assume hours become days, and assume communications and water services are living off their own short-duration backups. Most households prepare for darkness, not for the loss of conversion, the quiet disappearance of devices that turn one form of energy into another. Pumps that turn electricity into water pressure, compressors that turn electricity into cold, routers that turn electricity into information. The overlooked principle is that in an outage, the fight is against entropy, and entropy shows up as heat gain, contamination, and disorder. If you slow those flows, you buy time. Before the blackout hits, you front-load stored potential. Fill every clean container with tap water while it is treated and pressurized, including the bathtub if you have a liner. Because once pumps stop, the remaining water in pipes is a short-lived gift. Freeze what you can, and then treat the freezer like an insulated vault by reducing door openings, because every opening exchanges cold air for warm air and forces food safety to become a clock. Charge every lithium device, then shift from high-draw screens to low-draw radio reception. A simple battery radio outlasts a smartphone by an order of magnitude, and it gives you the one resource that changes behavior under stress: verified situational awareness. Fuel your vehicle early, not as an escape fantasy, but as a sealed container of energy that can charge devices and, with strict ventilation discipline, heat water. Most post-blackout deaths come from improvised indoor combustion, not from the cold itself. The protocol is not a shopping list, it is a sequence designed around decay rates. In the first hour, you preserve what spoils fastest and what becomes dangerous fastest. You stop running water before pressure fails, you shut off sensitive electronics to protect them from surges that arrive when circuits reclose, and you establish a no-flame rule indoors, unless you have a rated stove and a carbon monoxide alarm. In the first night, you convert confusion into rhythm by assigning tasks, rationing light, and keeping a written log of temperatures, water use, and news reports, because memory degrades under fatigue and fear. You also decide early whether your location can ride out a multi-day outage without outside help, because the worst moment to relocate is day 3, when fuel is scarce, traffic control is gone, and everyone else reaches the same conclusion. The next step is to treat your home like a microgrid, even if it has no solar panels, by managing energy, heat, and information as if they were currency. Treating the home like a microgrid begins at the breaker panel because the wiring already behaves like a distribution network. It simply lacks generation and control. When power returns unpredictably, the most damaging moment is often the partial restoration, when voltage and frequency wander and switching transients slam cheap power supplies. So the first defense is physical disconnection of anything you cannot afford to lose. The deeper move is triage. Decide which loads deserve scarce watts if your only source is a battery station, a vehicle inverter, or a generator. Every watt must purchase a function, not comfort, and that forces hard math because a refrigerator compressor can draw several times its running power at startup, and many inverters fail on surge rather than average load. Battery systems also have discharge curves and protective cutoffs. When you draw hard, voltage drops, the inverter alarms, and the battery may shut down while still holding energy you cannot access at high load. Thick cables reduce resistive losses and heat, and a fused connection prevents a short from becoming an arc flash. Lighting should be LED, not incandescent, because looming per watt becomes survival economics. If you choose to run a generator, it runs outside, far from openings, with exhaust carried away by wind, because carbon monoxide infiltrates quietly, and most deaths come from moving combustion closer to living space to steal back heat. Fuel is then treated like medicine, rationed, tracked, and protected from spill, fire, and theft, because once the neighborhood realizes resupply is uncertain, the value of stored energy rises faster than any other commodity. Energy triage is matched by thermal triage, governed by conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. In winter, uncontrolled air exchange is the fastest path to an unlivable interior, because each leak exports warm air and imports cold air your body must heat. Before the blackout, you locate drafts around doors, attic hatches, and window sashes, then seal with tape, towels, plastic film, or weather stripping, because a crude air barrier can cut heat loss dramatically. You then choose a living zone, close interior doors, and concentrate people, bedding, and insulation there, using blankets to block hallways and reflective surfaces behind any safe heat source to push radiant energy back into the zone. Clothing becomes part of the system. Loose layers trap air, and head and foot insulation reduce total heat loss. In summer, the physics reverses. Solar gain continues while ventilation stops, so shading, night flushing of hot air, and disciplined hydration become the controls that keep core temperature from drifting into the danger range. Water fails quietly, and sanitation fails violently. Municipal systems depend on pumps, chemical dosing, and pressure that keeps contamination out. When pressure drops, backflow can pull unsafe water through cracks and cross connections, and the water that still trickles may be less trustworthy than none. Stored tap water collected early remains your highest quality reserve, but you extend it by separating uses and by preventing the secondary disaster of gastrointestinal disease, which spreads through hands and surfaces faster than people expect during cramped outages. If toilets stop, you build a controlled waste system with a lined container, absorbent material, and a tight seal, and you keep it physically distant from food preparation because the dominant route is touch. Hand washing stays mandatory even when water is scarce. A small dose of water with soap outperforms sanitizer on dirty hands because soap lifts oils and microbes together. If you must treat new water, you rely on microbiology, not folklore. Boiling, chemical disinfection with correct concentration and contact time, and filtration that matches the threat, while remembering that many filters remove organisms but not dissolved industrial chemicals. You also remember the hidden reservoir inside the building, the water heater, accessible if you can isolate the tank without draining the system or pulling contaminants backward. Information management becomes survival management when the outage stretches because uncertainty manufactures rumor, and rumor concentrates crowds at the same fragile choke points. A battery radio used on a schedule gives verified signals without draining devices, while a written household plan prevents fatigue from turning minor disagreements into cascading failure inside the home. You set check-in times, assign roles, and define thresholds for action, including when refrigerated food crosses from edible to risky based on time and temperature, and when to relocate before fuel, traffic control, and medical response degrade further. You also anticipate the social physics of darkness. Intersections without signals increase collisions. Elevators trap occupants, and pharmacies become flashpoints when refrigeration fails. The concealed mechanism is behavioral load shedding, a mirror of electrical load shedding, because under sustained stress, the mind sheds tasks and narrows focus, and that narrowing can erase ventilation checks, water accounting, and fire discipline. You counter it with rituals, nightly inventory, combustion safety verification, and simple logs that treat batteries, fuel, and clean water as diminishing reserves. The next phase of the protocol is learning to read the outage itself, because the pattern of what returns briefly and what stays dead tells you whether the wider system is stabilizing or sliding into a longer disruption. To read the outage, you watch for asymmetry and for the character of the flicker. A clean restoration arrives like a firm wave. Voltage comes back stable, appliances start without stutter, cell service rebounds and holds, and the utility's public messaging becomes specific about circuits and times. A dirty restoration arrives in pulses. Power returns for minutes, drops again, and returns with dim lights that suggest low voltage on an overstressed feeder, which can cook motors and power supplies long before you notice damage. If you hear multiple reclosures on nearby lines, that clicking and brief brightening is the system's protection trying to clear faults. Repeated attempts usually mean broken conductors, flooded equipment, or trees still in contact, and that pushes the timeline toward days. At the regional scale, restoration depends on black start capability, the rare plants that can energize themselves without outside power, and then build islands that gradually synchronize, because a dead grid cannot simply be turned on. It must be grown like a crystal from stable seeds. That growth is limited by reactive power and voltage control, which is why long transmission lines, large motor loads, and depleted capacitor banks can stall progress even when generation exists. Historically documented outages show the same pattern. The first day is dominated by mechanical fragility, the second by logistics, and the third by human behavior. In the Northeast blackout of August 2003, the initiating faults were manageable, yet situational awareness failed, and cascading trips isolated vast areas, while water systems in transit ran on finite backup before stopping. The lesson is that redundancy exists, but it is timed, not infinite. During the Texas winter crisis of February 2021, the grid did not simply run out of electricity. Fuel supply chains froze, instruments iced, gas pressure dropped, and generators tripped under conditions they were not winterized for, showing that a blackout can be a cross-sector failure where electricity, gas, and water collapse together. After Hurricane Maria in 2017, Puerto Rico's grid suffered catastrophic transmission damage, and the restoration was measured in months, and households that treated the event as a short outage burned through fuel, batteries, and goodwill early. The protocol, therefore, uses early observations to choose a posture, conserve if the system is healing, or pivot to long-duration living if repeated pulses, widespread tower failures, and closed fuel stations indicate a logistics cliff. In that pivot, the most underestimated threat is not hunger but infection and injury. Food poisoning rises when refrigeration becomes a guess, and when people try to save meat that is warmed into the bacterial growth zone. Microbes, unlike humans, do not slow down because the lights are out. A thermometer in the fridge turns this from emotion into measurement, and cooking perishable food early while fuel and attention are available converts risk into calories that can be eaten immediately, or dried, salted, or shared. You also treat wounds aggressively because emergency departments run on generators and staffing, and as outages stretch, they triage harder, while pharmacies may close or lose refrigerated medications. A small stock of sterile dressings, soap, and a way to irrigate wounds with clean water prevents minor cuts from becoming systemic infections when sanitation is strained. Community becomes a multiplier if it is organized. A neighbor with a medical device may need a charging schedule. A household with a safe wood stove may offer warmth. A block can share news and deter opportunistic theft simply by being visible and coordinated. The hard rule is verification. Trade information only when you can name the source in the time, because outdated details send people into dangerous crowds and empty lines. Security in a blackout is less about confrontation and more about reducing incentives and accidents. Darkness increases falls, burns, and vehicle collisions, and open flames multiply those hazards. Most post-outage house fires come from candles left unattended or from improvised heaters placed too close to bedding in the very room people crowded into for warmth. You set a strict perimeter, exterior doors locked, windows covered to hide light discipline, pathways cleared, and a watch routine that is calm, not paranoid, because chronic adrenaline destroys sleep, and sleep is the substrate of judgment. Carbon monoxide remains the silent predator, because as temperatures drop, people bring combustion closer. The only acceptable rule is that anything that burns stays outside or is vented through rated flues, and alarms get fresh batteries before the outage. If evacuation becomes necessary, you move early in daylight with written routes, paper maps, and a fuel reserve you do not touch, because GPS and payment systems may fail while roads remain passable. The same cascading logic that topples a grid can topple traffic when signals go dark. The next step is to turn your household from a reactive consumer of reserves into a producer of stability by creating small sources of power, heat, and clean water that do not depend on a repaired nation-scale machine. Stability production starts with the simplest technology that still obeys the laws of physics: insulation, gravity, and sunlight. If you have any photovoltaic capacity, even a small panel, the critical upgrade is not raw wattage, but charge control, storage, and the discipline of using direct current loads when possible, because every conversion from DC to AC throws away energy as heat and drains limited storage. A panel feeding a battery through a proper controller can run radios, lights, and a small fan indefinitely if you match consumption to daily solar input, which means you stop thinking in hours of runtime and start thinking in watt-hours per day. If you have no solar, your vehicle becomes a generator with constraints. Idling consumes fuel and produces carbon monoxide, and alternators are designed to maintain a charged starting battery, not to serve as a continuous high-output power plant. You therefore use short, scheduled charging windows. Engine off whenever possible, and you keep cables sized to prevent voltage drop and overheating. For those who choose a portable generator, the survivable approach is to run it intermittently to recharge batteries, cool a fridge back down, or pump water, then shut it off, because continuous running invites fuel exhaustion, mechanical failure, and attention from anyone listening in the quiet. Noise is information. In a blackout, anything audible advertises resources. Heat production follows the same logic. You do not heat the house, you heat bodies and a small volume of air, because every extra cubic meter is a tax you cannot pay. The safest emergency heat is passive. Sleep systems rated for the temperature, layered bedding, and a sealed living zone. Because combustion inside the envelope is where most fatal errors occur. If you have a wood stove or fireplace, you treat it like an industrial device. You verify chimney integrity, keep combustibles at safe distances, manage sparks, and maintain ventilation, because incomplete combustion produces carbon monoxide even with visible flame. If you have only improvised options, you resist the urge to engineer miracles. The physics of combustion does not negotiate. In cold outages, hypothermia usually begins with wetness and fatigue rather than dramatic freezing, so you prioritize dry clothing, controlled sweating, and the conservation of metabolic heat by eating regularly. Calories are fuel for thermogenesis, and the body's ability to generate heat collapses when glycogen is depleted and when sleep debt accumulates. Clean water production is where science beats intuition. The fastest path in many environments is not fancy filtration, but controlled disinfection and careful sourcing. Rainwater collected from clean surfaces can be treated, but roofs can contribute microbes and chemicals, so first flush diversion and filtration matter. Surface water is often biologically active and sometimes chemically contaminated, so you assume pathogens unless proven otherwise. Boiling is mechanically reliable because it uses a simple threshold, sustained rolling boil, and it kills organisms, but it costs energy. And in a fuel-limited scenario, you may prefer chemical disinfection with correctly dosed household bleach, timed contact, and clear water to reduce shielding of microbes. Filtration adds safety when it is rated for the organism's size. Protozoa and bacteria are larger and easier to remove than viruses, which is why combining filtration with disinfection creates redundancy. You also manage storage like a lab. Clean containers, narrow openings, and minimal hand contact, because many outbreaks arise from recontaminating treated water. At the community scale, the hidden protocol that experienced emergency managers use is not secrecy, but sequencing. Stabilize life support functions, then stabilize information, then stabilize cooperation. People misunderstand blackouts because they picture a single utility problem, when the reality is interdependence. Water treatment needs power, fuel distribution needs power and telecommunications, hospitals need fuel and staffing depends on fuel, childcare, and safe roads. When those loops break, restoration slows and improvisation rises. The practical implication is that the household that can remain calm, measure its reserves, and reduce its demands becomes harder to destabilize. You cultivate redundancy not by hoarding gadgets, but by building overlapping capabilities. Multiple ways to make light, multiple ways to disinfect water, multiple ways to cook, and multiple ways to receive information. You also establish a local trust network early, because during the first day, people are still open to coordination, while later they become siloed by fear and scarcity. As days stretch, the blackout stops being an event and becomes an environment, and that is where psychology becomes infrastructure. The mind resists long uncertainty by seeking definitive stories, which is why rumors spread faster than facts. Your defense is to anchor decisions to measurable triggers and to accept that waiting can be active when it is structured. You plan for the moment when outside temperature, indoor temperature, and fuel reserves intersect to create a deadline, and you rehearse on paper how you will move people and critical items if you must. You also recognize that the most dangerous time is the false dawn, when partial restoration tempts everyone to plug in everything at once, spiking demand and causing another drop. Utilities sometimes ask for staged reconnection for this reason, and your protocol aligns by keeping non-essential loads off until stability holds. The final segment turns from household mechanics to the larger pattern of why blackouts are becoming more consequential and what that means for anyone who wants to live through the next one without panic. Blackouts are becoming more consequential not because humans forgot how to build power plants, but because the margin between normal operation and instability has narrowed as societies stacked more precision onto systems that still obey friction, corrosion, and weather. Transmission corridors run hotter when demand peaks, transformers age in silence until insulation breaks down, vegetation grows back faster than maintenance cycles, and extreme heat and cold push both the equipment and the fuel supply chain toward limits that were once rare. At the same time, the grid has become more tightly coupled to other networks that are optimized for efficiency rather than slack. Supermarkets carry days of inventory. Hospitals depend on scheduled deliveries of oxygen and fuel, and payment systems assume uninterrupted connectivity, so a loss of electrons quickly becomes a loss of coordination. Even when generation exists, restoration can be delayed by mundane constraints like blocked roads, exhausted crews, frozen valves, or the simple fact that a long transmission line needs reactive support to hold voltage before it can carry real power, which means the comeback is not a heroic flip of a switch, but a careful rebuilding of stability. This is why the blackout protocol begins before the event, in the quiet hours when everything still works and complacency feels rational. The hidden science is buffering. Every household already relies on stored energy, stored water, stored food safety, and stored social order, but most of those buffers are invisible until they drain, so the task is to make them visible and then extend them. You do that by converting fragile, high-speed conveniences into slower, more robust forms. Water in containers instead of water in pipes. Food that can be eaten safely without refrigeration instead of food that demands a compressor. Light that sips milliwatts instead of light that guzzles amps. Information that arrives by radio in scheduled doses instead of information that depends on towers and algorithms. You map your dependencies as flows, not objects, because what fails is not the thing, but the link. The phone is fine until the charger is dead. The stove is fine until the ignition needs electricity. The heater is fine until the blower stops. The tap is fine until pressure drops and the water becomes a question. When you view the home as a set of flows, you stop wasting effort on dramatic gestures and start buying time. And in outages, time is the resource that lets outside systems repair themselves before your internal system breaks. Buying time also changes how you move through the social landscape of an outage, because scarcity is contagious when people respond in herds. The safest households are not the most heavily equipped, but the ones that remain legible to themselves. They know how many liters are clean, how many watt-hours are usable, how many hours of refrigeration remain before risk rises, and how many days of calories exist without opening the freezer. That clarity reduces panic, and reduced panic prevents mistakes that are statistically lethal, like running combustion indoors, driving through dark intersections, or eating food that is warmed too long. It also makes cooperation possible, because you can offer precise help without endangering your own reserves, and that precision builds trust, while rumor dissolves it. In a prolonged outage, the community that shares verified information, checks on the medically vulnerable, and rotates simple security presence becomes a stabilizing organism, while the community that collapses into isolated households becomes a field of competing anxieties that accelerates conflict. And there is one more technical detail that determines whether your preparation actually survives contact with reality: The surge when power returns. Utilities re-energize feeders progressively, but every neighborhood that left heaters, stoves, chargers, and compressors switched on creates an instant demand spike and a chaotic rush of motor starts, and that can drag voltage down and trip protection again. Keeping your main loads off, reconnecting in stages, and letting the grid settle is not politeness, it is self-preservation. Because repeated brownouts damage compressors, electronics, and batteries faster than a clean outage ever would. The final warning is not about darkness, but about the realization that convenience trained many people to confuse supply with certainty. Electricity is not comfort, it is the scaffolding that keeps water clean, air breathable in sealed buildings, food safe at scale, and medical care functional. And when it disappears, you see, in raw thermodynamic terms, how quickly order decays unless someone spends energy to hold it. The protocol is therefore a discipline of humility. Prepare early while the grid is still your ally. Practice the motions so they cost fewer calories under stress, and treat every stored resource as a bridge to a future where repair catches up with failure. If you wait for the blackout to teach you, the lesson arrives as a cascade, first in the pantry, then in the pipes, then in the body, and finally in the mind. And once the mind is compromised, the rest follows. Do the work before the lights go out, because when the silence arrives and the city's machines stop speaking, the only system you can fully control is the one you built inside your own walls.